Hello, everybody. Again, this is Miss Peachy with your WCA Biology B class. And here I are in Unit 4, Lesson 10, Disturbances in Ecosystems. So there's lots of review in this lesson. It's kind of one of those ones where you're going to see images that pop back from previous lessons and even some kind of passages, I think, that have been kind of restated. So here we are with the keywords biodiversity, community, ecosystem, and population. And so I did again make a study guide that goes with it, is linked below. I wanted to point it out specifically because I also included in this study guide a graphic with the ecological hierarchy listed again, because this is reiterated over and over again in all of these lessons. It's never explicitly written out, and you don't have a graphic that looks like this, but I did make sure we have that here. Remembering that we start with an individual, and from individual, we go to population, which is all members of the same species that live in the same area. Then community, which is multiple populations of organisms that live in the community or in that area together. And when we include the abiotic factors, we're talking about ecosystems. We haven't really addressed biomes yet. The biosphere is all living things on Earth, but I just wanted to make sure we pointed that out because they are continuing to talk about the effects that these things have on multiple levels, at the level of the individual, at the level of the population, and at the level of the community. So how are certain disturbances, how do they affect ecosystems? How do they have an impact on biodiversity? So it talks about natural forces. Some of the natural forces could be things like melting snow, hurricanes, that type of stuff. And then we have our human interactions, including clear cutting of forests, pollution, all those types of things can be human interactions, other types of habitat destruction. Ecosystems are complex, so they're very much interrelated. So you have one part of an ecosystem which affects another part of an ecosystem. An effect, on one species might actually impact another species as well, right? So different communities can be affected by other communities. So disruptions happen all the time. They are normal and natural. In a healthy ecosystem, all of the different parts are in balance, and we call the state of being in balance homeostasis. It's kind of an interesting word to use here because oftentimes you think of homeostasis as what happens within an individual organism that keeps the organism's body systems in a state of internal balance, and we call that as the state of homeostasis. But we're looking at the whole ecosystem as kind of like an organism in a way, right? There's different parts to it, and they all kind of work together. So it also has to maintain a balance. And this balance is that state of homeostasis. So even though there are disruptions in an ecosystem, in a healthy ecosystem, those disruptions um, are still able to be weathered in such a way that the whole ecosystem stays within a state of homeostasis. Even though it looks like a big impact, a big, disturbance, the impact itself is temporary, and so then it stays in a state of homeostasis. It's where these impacts become larger and not temporary that we have issues, right? So again, it says the stability does not mean the ecosystem is never disrupted, but that for most routine disruptions, the ecosystem can return to its original homeostasis. When an ecosystem becomes unstable, though, homeostasis can be lost completely. So again, biodiversity, those are those different a number of organisms found within the same area, can affect all levels of that ecological hierarchy. Can affect just a population, one type of organism, or it can affect all members of the ecosystem, which we call the community. So it's talking here about the kelp forest and how the kelp forest is a particular ecosystem. The shark is a top predator, and if something were to happen to the sharks, that could have a cascading effect that would affect all levels of that particular ecosystem. And it kind of talks about the different levels here, which I will let you guys read through to understand some of the effects. You know, that just because the sharks are gone, that it's not just the sharks that are impacted, but there are other levels of that ecosystem that are impacted as well. Let's see here. So it says here that some changes happen routinely and regularly, more cyclically, if you will. Seasonal changes are changes that happen obviously every season, and so they kind of happen in a cycle. They change the landscape from, you know, maybe we see that in Wisconsin, right? Very, very different in summer than in winter. This can change lots of different parts of the ecosystem, can change the vegetation, can change the flow of the river, and even can change the organisms that live there, because some migrate to warmer climates during the colder months as well. So while these are changes, they are cyclical, they are routine, they are things that that ecosystem has adapted to, and it still is able to maintain homeostasis. There are other natural changes that may not be regularly occurring, um, not temporary, for example. Some of those things might be severe weather that has completely impacted an area and changed the landscape, maybe a tornado that has come through and completely destroyed a forest, for example. We've talked before about the introduction of new species, invasive species, increased predation. Maybe you have more top predators than were there before. That also has a cascading effect on the lower levels of the food pyramid. If you take human activity, damming of a river, for example, can really change a lot of things, change the water level, change the current, change the water quality. It really does change the entire landscape. And during the time of the disturbance, then there might be a loss of biodiversity. Over time, a new homeostasis has been achieved, although it might be different from what it was previously. And even with that new homeostasis, you might have a reduction overall permanently in biodiversity and perhaps even a loss of species depending on the type of change that we're seeing. Um, so that's pretty much the gist of this one. There's some questions and some videos for you to go through, and it talks more about, you know, disturbances in ecosystems and homeostasis. It does talk about how it's really difficult in some ecosystems to even tell how much of an impact we are making as human beings because we just don't know the ecosystem well enough. There's so much diversity, for example, in the rainforest, that we can't really see the impact on biodiversity that we're making because we don't even know the extent of the biodiversity that exists there to begin with. There are species we have not identified, so we wouldn't even know how impactful our activity is, our disturbances are in some of these ecosystems that are really biodiverse and less explored. That's pretty much it, you guys, for this lesson. It's fairly short. It's somewhat repetitive with some of the stuff we've done earlier. If you've got questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in the next one.